Most people think plants grow because you keep feeding them. More fertilizer, more growth. That's the logic. And it seems to work at first. Leaves turn greener for a few days, maybe a week. Then everything slows down again. The color fades. Growth stalls. So you feed again. But here's the pattern most people miss. The more often you feed, the shorter that recovery window becomes. Until eventually, nothing changes at all. Not even after fresh fertilizer. What's actually happening is not a lack of nutrients. In most cases, those nutrients are already sitting in the soil and used. The real failure is that the plant has stopped accessing them. I've seen plants restart visible growth in under 7 days without adding any fertilizer, simply by reactivating a process most people never think about. And once that process shuts down, adding more nutrients doesn't fix it, it blocks it even further. The problem isn't what you're adding. It's what the plant can no longer take in. The first visible change is almost always the same: color loss. Leaves shift from deep green to a lighter, slightly dull tone. Not completely yellow, just less saturated. Growth slows at the tips. New shoots appear smaller than the previous set. That's the moment most people label it a nutrient deficiency. So they respond immediately. Fertilizer gets added, often at full strength, sometimes more frequently than before. Within 48 to 72 hours, there's a subtle improvement. Leaves firm up slightly. Color deepens just enough to confirm the assumption. Then it stops again. Not gradually. It plateaus. The next set of leaves doesn't improve. Stem extension remains short. And the plant looks like it's maintaining, not progressing. That's the first misread. Because the temporary improvement isn't recovery. It's a short-term uptake spike from easily accessible ions already near the root zone. Once those are used, the system returns to its previous state. Now a second pattern appears. Water behavior changes. Instead of soaking in evenly, water starts to pool briefly on the surface. In some cases, it runs off to the sides before absorbing. If you press the soil lightly, the top layer feels tighter than before. Dig down 2 to 3 centimeters, and you'll often find one of two extremes: consistently damp, slightly sticky soil, or compacted, resistant soil that breaks in chunks. Both indicate the same underlying issue: reduced oxygen availability. But this is rarely interpreted correctly. Instead, watering frequency increases because the surface looks dry faster, and feeding continues because growth hasn't resumed. This combination accelerates the problem. With repeated fertilizer input, dissolved salts begin to accumulate in the root zone. You won't see the salts directly, but you can observe their effect within days. Root tips stop extending. Fine root hairs become less visible. Soil dries unevenly, wet below, dry above. At the same time, microbial activity declines. That shift is critical, because microbes are responsible for converting stored nutrients into usable forms. When their activity drops, nutrient conversion slows. Not completely, but enough to create a mismatch. Nutrients are present, but not in the right form, at the right time. So the plant shows deficiency symptoms, while sitting in nutrient-rich soil. That contradiction is where most people get trapped. They see deficiency and respond with more input. But the real issue is not supply. It's processing capacity. You can verify this directly. Take soil from around a struggling plant and compress it in your hand. If it holds its shape and resists breaking apart, oxygen diffusion is already limited. That alone is enough to reduce aerobic microbial function, the exact organisms required for nutrient cycling. Now compare it to soil from a plant that's actively growing. It won't hold together the same way. It fractures easily. There's internal space, small air pockets you can't see but can feel. That structure allows oxygen to move, which allows microbes to function, which allows nutrients to convert. That chain is what determines growth. But most interventions never address it. They focus on adding more into a system that's already stopped processing what it has. And every time that happens, the gap between what's present and what's usable gets wider. What determines whether a plant grows is not how much nutrient exists in the soil, but how much of it is being actively converted into a form the roots can absorb at that exact moment. Because in most garden soils there is already a significant reserve of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but these elements are locked inside organic matter and mineral structures that roots cannot access directly. The entire system depends on microbial activity, primarily aerobic bacteria and fungi, and this activity only remains stable when oxygen is consistently available and moisture is balanced rather than excessive. When soil stays loose and oxygen can move freely, bacteria begin breaking down organic material into simpler compounds, while fungal networks extend outward, accessing nutrients beyond the immediate root zone and transporting them back in exchange for plant sugars. Through this process, nitrogen is converted into ammonium and nitrate, phosphorus becomes soluble phosphate, and potassium shifts into exchangeable forms that roots can absorb. But this conversion does not happen continuously. It happens in cycles, which is why healthy plants often show visible growth bursts every 5 to 10 days instead of steady daily progress. You can observe whether this system is active by watching how the soil behaves. Because in active soil, water infiltrates within seconds instead of pooling. Moisture distributes evenly rather than forming wet pockets, and the structure remains loose and crumbly instead of compacting into dense clumps when pressed. When the system begins to fail, those signals reverse quickly. Water either sits briefly on the surface or drains unevenly. The top layer dries too fast, while deeper layers stay wet. And when you compress the soil, it holds its shape instead of breaking apart. The moment oxygen drops, whether from compaction or repeated watering, microbial activity declines within a short time frame, often within just a few days. And once that happens, nutrient conversion slows to the point where roots are no longer receiving a consistent supply of usable ions. At that stage, the plant behaves as if it is deficient even when nutrients are physically present, which is why growth does not just slow but becomes completely flat, with no new shoots and no response to additional feeding, because the limiting factor is no longer nutrient quantity but biological processing capacity. And once that capacity is reduced, adding more input does not restore the system. It increases imbalance and further blocks access to what is already there. Stop feeding the plant. Take it out of the pot. Leave the roots exposed to air. Most people do the exact opposite at this stage. They see a struggling plant and assume the roots need more support. So they keep it buried, keep the soil wet, and keep adding nutrients. But what they are actually doing is trapping the root system inside an environment that has already lost oxygen and stopped functioning. The visible failure before this point is consistent. Growth has stalled completely. The soil stays wet longer than it should, and even when the surface looks dry, deeper layers remain damp and compacted, which prevents air from reaching the root zone. The common reaction is to water again or add fertilizer to force a response, but neither works because the limiting factor is no longer nutrients. It is oxygen availability around the roots. Once oxygen drops below a certain threshold, root respiration slows down, microbial activity collapses, and nutrient conversion stops, which means the plant is effectively cut off from both energy exchange and nutrient uptake at the same time. The correction feels aggressive, but it directly targets the failure point. Removing the plant from the pot immediately breaks the saturated, compacted environment and allows oxygen to reach the root's surface within minutes, not hours. Leaving the roots exposed for a short period, typically 30 to 90 minutes depending on humidity, allows excess moisture to evaporate and restores conditions that favor aerobic microbes rather than anaerobic ones. Once the roots are no longer constantly wet, you can observe a clear difference in structure. Healthy roots remain firm and slightly elastic, while damaged sections appear darker and softer, and this contrast becomes visible only when the root system is exposed. After replanting into loose soil, without adding any fertilizer, the system begins to reset. Oxygen levels stabilize, microbial activity gradually returns, and within a few days the plant often shows the first measurable response. Leaf firmness improves, and new growth points begin to activate. The broader insight is that root function is controlled less by what you add and more by the physical environment you maintain. And when that environment fails, the fastest way to restore it is not to supplement the system, but to interrupt it, remove the restriction, and allow oxygen to re-enter, because without that, no amount of nutrients will ever reach the plant in a usable form. Most people throw kitchen scraps into the soil thinking they are feeding the plant, but what actually happens in most cases is the opposite. The scraps begin to rot in thick, wet pockets. Oxygen disappears locally, and instead of supporting microbial activity, they create small anaerobic zones that roots avoid. The visible failure is easy to recognize if you look closely. The soil around buried scraps turns darker and sticky. There is often a slight sour smell, and growth near that area either slows or stops completely even though organic material was added. The common response is to either add more scraps, assuming quantity will fix the issue, or to mix them deeper into the soil, which only spreads the same problem across a larger area. The correction is counterintuitive because it reduces input instead of increasing it. Organic material should be applied in very thin layers, almost like a surface dusting rather than a buried mass, and ideally allowed to dry slightly before being added, so it does not immediately collapse into a wet, compact layer. This works because thin layers decompose under aerobic conditions, where oxygen remains available and microbial populations can process material gradually instead of being overwhelmed. In this state, bacteria break down simple compounds first, fungi begin to colonize the material, and nutrients are released in small, continuous amounts that match the plant's uptake capacity instead of flooding the system all at once. You can observe the difference directly over time. A thick buried clump remains visible, wet, and often foul-smelling for days or weeks, while a thin surface layer begins to disappear within a few days, integrating into the soil without forming dense pockets. There is also a timing pattern that becomes clear once this method is used correctly. Instead of a regular growth followed by stagnation, plants begin to show small but consistent bursts of new development every few days, which indicates that nutrient conversion is happening in cycles rather than in unstable spikes. The broader insight is that organic matter is not automatically beneficial. Its effect depends entirely on how it interacts with oxygen and microbial capacity, and when applied in a controlled, thin layer, it becomes a steady input that supports the system instead of disrupting it. Most people leave the soil surface completely exposed because it looks clean and controlled, but that exposure is exactly what destabilizes the entire system. Because once soil is bare, moisture loss accelerates, temperature fluctuates sharply between day and night, and microbial activity becomes inconsistent within just a few hours. The visible pattern is predictable if you pay attention. The top layer dries out quickly even after watering. Small cracks begin to form, and growth above ground becomes uneven, with brief spurts followed by longer pauses that do not respond to additional watering or feeding. The common reaction is to compensate by watering more frequently, sometimes daily. But this creates a split condition in the soil profile where the surface cycles between dry and wet while deeper layers remain constantly damp, and this imbalance reduces oxygen movement through the soil, which directly suppresses the microbial processes responsible for nutrient conversion. Over time, this leads to the same outcome as overwatering, reduced root respiration, slower nutrient availability, and a plant that appears to need more input while actually losing its ability to use what is already there. The correction is simple but often overlooked. The soil surface should be covered with a light layer of material, not thick enough to block air exchange, but enough to protect the top layer from rapid evaporation. This layer stabilizes temperature, slows down moisture loss, and creates a more consistent environment where microbes can remain active throughout the day instead of cycling between stress and recovery. You can observe the effect within a short time frame. Covered soil stays darker and slightly moist for longer, water infiltration becomes more even, and the top layer no longer forms a hard crust after drying. There is also a measurable shift in how often watering is needed. Instead of reacting to surface dryness within hours, the soil maintains usable moisture for a longer period, often extending watering intervals by 1 to 2 days depending on conditions, and this longer cycle allows oxygen to re-enter the soil between watering events, which supports both root respiration and microbial activity. The broader insight is that soil exposure is not neutral. It actively works against stability, and by simply covering the surface, you are not adding nutrients, but preserving the conditions that make nutrient conversion possible, which has a greater impact on growth than repeated external inputs. Most people water based on the surface, not the root zone, and that single habit is enough to keep the entire system unstable, because the top layer of soil can dry within hours while the deeper root zone remains wet for much longer, especially in compacted conditions. The visible failure pattern is consistent. Plants develop shallow roots, growth becomes slow and irregular, and the soil never fully transitions between wet and dry, which is necessary for oxygen exchange. Even though the plant is being watered frequently, it never shows strong, sustained growth, only short-lived improvements that fade quickly. The common response is to water more often because the surface looks dry, but this prevents the deeper layers from ever drying out, which means oxygen cannot re-enter the soil profile effectively. Without that oxygen, root respiration slows, microbial activity declines, and nutrient conversion becomes inconsistent, creating the same bottleneck even when moisture and nutrients are technically present. The correction is to reverse the pattern completely. Instead of frequent light watering, the soil should be saturated deeply in a single session, allowing water to reach the full root depth, and then left alone until the upper layer dries again. This creates a full cycle. Water fills the pore spaces. Then, as it drains and evaporates, oxygen is pulled back into the soil, restoring the conditions needed for both root function and microbial activity. You can observe the difference in root behavior over time. Plants begin extending roots deeper into the soil rather than staying near the surface, and growth becomes more stable, with less fluctuation between rapid response and stagnation. There is also a clear timing indicator that becomes reliable once this method is applied. The top 2 to 3 centimeters of soil can appear dry without indicating stress. Because the deeper layers still hold moisture, and waiting through that dry surface phase allows the soil to complete its oxygen exchange cycle. The broader insight is that watering frequency controls oxygen availability more than moisture supply. And by reducing frequency, while increasing depth, you are not giving the plant less water, you are restoring the conditions that allow the roots and microbes to function together, which results in stronger, more consistent growth without increasing input. Once the system starts recovering, most failures don't come from neglect, they come from reintroducing the exact conditions that caused the slowdown in the first place, usually without realizing it. The first mistake is returning to frequent fertilizing too early, because early recovery often shows up as slightly greener leaves or small new shoots within a few days, and that visual improvement triggers the instinct to support the plant. But at this stage, the microbial system is still stabilizing, and adding concentrated nutrients increases salt levels in the root zone, which immediately reduces microbial activity and interrupts the conversion process that just started to recover. The second mistake is physically compressing the soil after replanting, either by pressing it down to secure the plant or by overworking it during watering. And while it may feel like you are improving root contact, what you are actually doing is reducing pore space, which limits oxygen movement and quickly recreates the same low-oxygen environment that shut the system down before. This can be observed within a short time frame. Water begins to infiltrate more slowly again, and the soil starts holding together instead of crumbling when handled. The third mistake is using chemical pesticides or treatments that disrupt microbial life, especially in the root zone, because many of these products do not differentiate between harmful organisms and beneficial ones, and even a single application can significantly reduce microbial populations, which directly affects nutrient conversion. The effect is not always immediate above ground, but within days the same pattern returns, growth stalls, and the plant stops responding to otherwise stable conditions. The fourth mistake is maintaining constant moisture, often out of caution, because once a plant has struggled, people tend to avoid letting it dry at all, but keeping the soil continuously wet prevents oxygen from re-entering the system, which shifts conditions back toward anaerobic activity and slows both root respiration and microbial processes. This creates a subtle but persistent suppression that is harder to detect than overwatering damage, but just as effective at stopping growth. All of these mistakes share the same underlying mechanism. They reduce oxygen availability and disrupt microbial balance, which shuts down nutrient conversion regardless of how much input is present. The key pattern to recognize is that recovery depends on restoring function, not increasing supply, and any action that compresses soil, saturates it continuously, or introduces disruptive chemicals will reverse that progress even if everything else appears correct. What most people remember from this kind of system is not the technique, but the assumption behind it, and that assumption is the real shift. The idea that plant growth is something you add to through fertilizer is only half of the picture, because in a functioning soil system, most of the nutrients are already present before anything is applied, stored in organic matter, mineral particles, and biological residues that accumulate naturally over time. The limiting factor is not supply, it is accessibility, and accessibility is controlled almost entirely by living processes in the soil, not by external inputs. When you look at it this way, the role of fertilizer changes completely. Instead of being the primary driver of growth, it becomes a secondary input that only works when the biological system is already active enough to process it. Without that system, fertilizer does not disappear into growth. It accumulates in forms the plant cannot use, and this is why adding more often produces weaker results instead of stronger ones. The grandfather's approach was not about avoiding inputs. It was about maintaining the conditions that keep the internal system functioning continuously, which means oxygen availability, stable moisture cycles, and undisturbed microbial activity. Once those conditions are in place, the soil behaves less like a passive medium and more like an active processing layer, constantly converting stored material into usable nutrients in small, regular pulses that match plant demand. The deeper realization is that plants are not isolated consumers of fertilizer. They are part of a closed exchange system where roots, microbes, and soil structure are tightly linked, and when one part collapses, the others cannot compensate by volume alone. This is why more input never solves a broken system. It only exposes that the system is no longer processing what it already has. So the real shift is not from fertilizer versus no fertilizer, but from input-based thinking to system-based thinking, where growth is understood as the outcome of continuous biological conversion rather than external supplementation. And once that is understood, the question stops being what to add and becomes what is preventing the soil from working in the first place. What looks like weak soil in most home gardens is rarely a lack of nutrients. It is a loss of function inside the soil system, where oxygen movement slows, microbial activity collapses, and nutrient conversion stops happening at a usable rate even though the raw materials are still present. In that state, fertilizer does not solve the problem because it assumes the limiting factor is supply, when in reality the limiting factor is processing. Once the system is understood correctly, the pattern becomes consistent and predictable. Plants don't need more inputs to recover, they need restored conditions that allow existing nutrients to move through biological pathways again. That is why changes like soil loosening, oxygen restoration, moisture cycling, and controlled organic matter breakdown often produce visible improvement faster than repeated feeding, because they restart the internal conversion process instead of bypassing it. The key takeaway is simple but strict in logic. Growth is not created by adding more to the plant. It is created by restoring the soil's ability to process what is already there. When that ability is active, nutrients cycle in small, continuous pulses that match plant demand, and when it is inactive, even high nutrient availability produces no response. Once this distinction is clear, every decision in the garden shifts away from accumulation and toward condition control, because the real driver of growth is not input volume, but system activity.